Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is, in my opinion, the best spin-off series in the franchise. This series has made a name for itself by having stories, characters, and world building that often rival, if not surpass, the main series, and it has grown quite a cult following as a result. The gameplay itself might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's hard to deny the sheer charm this series has. That's why it's surprising to me that it's been almost an entire decade since the last new entry in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. Sure, we received Rescue Team DX a few years ago, and the original Red Rescue Team was added to Nintendo Switch Online recently, but 3 entire Pokemon generations have passed since the last brand new game. Many fans like myself have been left wondering why one of the most popular spin-off series in Pokemon history has seemingly been forgotten. That's why I decided to dive into the history of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon to see if I could find an explanation for the seeming abandonment of such a beloved franchise. In this video, I'll be discussing what I found and what it might mean for the future of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. In case you're unfamiliar with Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, let's do a quick run-through so you're all caught up. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is one branch of a larger Mystery Dungeon tree, which is a series of games with the same general core gameplay developed by Chunsoft. In contrast with the main Pokemon series, you play as a Pokemon in these games. In most of the games, the Pokemon you play as is chosen by taking a personality quiz at the start of the game, which has become one of the most iconic aspects of the series. You are then given the choice of a partner Pokemon who will be your companion during the game. You usually then join some form of a rescue team, where you help Pokemon who have become lost or hurt in the various dungeons around the region. Over time, you meet a wide variety of different Pokemon, and the story begins to unfold, both of which are usually the strongest aspects of games in the series. Honestly though, this series has made me cry more often than any Pokemon game has a right to. The core gameplay loop revolves around exploring procedurally generated dungeons, meaning that each time you go into a dungeon, the floor layouts will be completely different. Combat in the dungeons is turn-based, with every step you take or move you use counting as a turn. Overall, if you have played any roguelike games, you'll be familiar with this kind of gameplay. Some people love it, some people hate it, but ultimately it's a core staple of the series. So that's a quick overview of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Obviously, each individual game in the series differs a bit from the overall formula, but this gives you a good sense of what the series is about. Honestly, hours-long video essays could be written about each individual game, and there are probably some out there, but that's not what this video is for. With all that out of the way, let's get into the history and reception of each game in the series to see how we ended up going 10 years with no new game. I vividly remember the lead up to the release of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS respectively. Being 9 years old at the time, the idea of being able to play a Pokemon game as an actual Pokemon was mind-blowing to me, and it ended up being the first game I ever pre-ordered. I was certainly over the moon with the game, and it's definitely held in high regard for fans of the series, but it started the long-running pattern of poor critical reception for these games. Despite the games having a Metacritic aggregate critic score in the 60s, they went on to sell over 5 million units combined. The games even went on to have an anime and a manga series created based on the premise of the games. Despite its lukewarm reception by video game journalists at the time, it's clear that there was fan interest in the series, and so a sequel quickly began development. 2 years later, Chunsoft released what many fans would consider the best entry in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, Explorers of Time and Darkness, with Explorers of Sky releasing a couple years later and serving as the definitive third version in the same style as the main series. I would consider these games to be the most emotionally impactful, as well as having the best written characters of any Pokemon game, main series included. The developers clearly learned what worked from the Rescue Team games and what didn't, and thus created a more refined experience, though keeping most of the core gameplay loop intact. Despite all the improvements made to storytelling, gameplay mechanics, and character writing to these games, Explorers of Time and Darkness would end up with an even worse review from critics than the previous games, with Explorers of Sky somehow scoring even lower, despite positive fan reception. To be clear, I respect that everyone has different opinions on games, but as I was reading through critic reviews, many of them seemed downright lazy or in bad faith. I could reference the infamous IGN review where the reviewer barely even played the game, or the various irrelevant sites that write 3 or 4 paragraphs and are somehow counted as game critics, but that would be giving them more credit than they deserve. Despite the reviews though, these games would go on to sell a combined total of over 7 million units, making them the best-selling Pokemon spin-off games. Like the Rescue Team games, they also got their own anime adaptation, and seriously, if you haven't played Explorers of Sky yet, I highly recommend it. Unfortunately though, this would end up being the peak of the series in terms of sales and arguably quality, as the next release would start a trend the series has so far never recovered from. For the first time in series history, it seems critics and fans were finally in agreement, but sadly, it was because Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity was just not a great game. From removing beloved series staples like the personality test to only featuring a mere 150 Pokemon in the entire game, to focusing on unnecessary gimmicks like the use of the 3DS camera, Spike Chunsoft made many questionable decisions in the development of this game. This is clearly reflected in the sales of the game as well, as it's the worst-selling entry in the series, and it may have done permanent damage to the series moving forward, as we'll soon see. 2 years later, in 2015, Super Pokemon Mystery Dungeon would release, and it's clear the developers listened to fan complaints. In many ways, this entry was a return to form for the series and brought back many series staples, including the personality test and a large increase in the amount of Pokemon you can encounter. While it is the highest rated game in the series in terms of critic reviews, the gap between fan reception and professional reviews also returned with this entry. However, despite the more positive reception this game received across the board, sales were only slightly higher than Gates to Infinity, and likely left the developers and the Pokemon Company to wonder if it was time to move on from this series. It would be several more years until we received the next Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game, and it would end up being a remake of the first games. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX. This entry sported a beautiful watercolor-inspired art style, as well as several quality of life upgrades that made this the best version to experience the story from the first games. This was clearly an attempt to breathe some life into the series and let new fans experience the roots of the series, and in that respect, I think it was a great entry. As you can probably already guess at this point though, reception was mixed. With sales hovering around 1.9 million units on the most popular Nintendo system in history and released during a time when everyone was stuck at home with nothing to do but play video games, its commercial success isn't all that impressive, and it seems the developers likely agree, given that we haven't heard much from the series since then. While I personally think this was a great entry and a great remake, it clearly didn't do enough to end the slump the series has been in for years. With Pokemon Mystery Dungeon seemingly being unable to recapture the popularity it once had, that leaves us to speculate what comes next, and if it even has a future to begin with. Personally, I'm not entirely optimistic about what comes next for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, mostly due to 2 factors: poor critical reception and, relatedly, poor sales. You may have noticed I've been focusing a lot on the critical reception to these games, and that's for a reason. Casual consumers, the kinds of people who don't watch YouTube videos about dormant Pokemon series for example, often turn to sites like IGN or Metacritic to get a sense of whether a game is worth buying. And as you've seen throughout this video, professional reviewers are often not the series' audience. While obviously not the only factor, I believe this poor reception from critics is one of the causes of the declining sales of the series. While selling 1 to 3 million units to hardcore fans might have been justifiable during the Game Boy Advance, DS, and 3DS eras, HD development costing more and only resulting in a slight increase in sales may no longer be financially justifiable to continue the series. The somewhat niche genre of roguelike gameplay is also probably doing it no favors. Of course, this is all speculation, and a new game could be announced at the next Nintendo Direct and make this entire video pointless. If a new game was announced though, my money is on an Explorers remake. These games already have a positive reputation in the fanbase, which makes word of mouth easier to spread. It's also cheaper from a development point of view, given that the story has already been written, making it a less risky investment. Given that they already created a remake art style and have experience working in the engine they used for the Rescue Team remake, it seems like the most likely outcome, in my opinion. With Shiren the Wanderer, one of Spike Chunsoft's other roguelikes, being released earlier this year, that might have freed them up to work on a new Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. However, we'll just have to wait and see what the future holds for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Like most other Pokemon spin-off series these days, it seems Pokemon Mystery Dungeon might be languishing in dormancy for the foreseeable future, which is a shame given the quality of most of the entries in the series. I would love to be proven wrong though, so I guess the only thing we can do is continue to wait and see. I would love to hear about your opinions on Pokemon Mystery Dungeon though. Did you ever play any of the games, and if so, did you like them? Let me know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing as it really helps me out. And I'll catch you next time.